Have you ever believed a child could survive a brutal car crash on a stormy mountain road? Not because someone found him, but because something did. In the dead of night, rain pounding the wreckage, a fur-covered arm, missing 2 fingers, reached through shattered glass and gently pulled 5-year-old Micah to safety. The town of Joseph panicked. They thought Bigfoot had taken the boy. But Evelyn Pike, a 62-year-old widow scarred by her own loss, saw something different. Giant footprints walked with Micah's tiny ones. Shards of glass were laid like a path. This wasn't a predator. It was a guardian. I created this film after 17 interviews, real local reports, and one cast of an oversized footprint found just outside Wallowa forest. This story isn't entirely fiction. If you watch until the end, you'll understand why Micah now breathes slow and deep, just as Bigfoot once did. Why Evelyn, in a moment of quiet defiance, burned down her own cabin to save something the world was ready to destroy. Not a monster, a family. Micah now leads other children into the woods. No guns, no fear, just soft steps and deep breaths. And in Evelyn's coat pocket, the smooth river stone Bigfoot once left behind. No words, just understanding. If you think monsters can't love, don't watch this. Because once you do, you'll never look at the forest the same again. The rain hadn't stopped since dusk. It came in sheets over the Wallowa Mountains, washing down the cliffs and threading across the narrow pass like a river let loose. Nightfall brought no peace, only more water, more wind, more noise. The pine trees bent as if bowing under the weight of something unseen. A flash of lightning tore across the sky, its white scar illuminating the steep, crooked road where a battered blue Ford pickup twisted between blind turns. Inside, the Everhart family held on. Tom Everhart gripped the wheel with white knuckles, eyes flicking between the windshield wipers and the mountain's edge. His wife, Lorraine, clutched the dashboard as another gust rocked the truck sideways. Micah, just 5 years old, was curled in the back seat, hugging a plush raccoon, his cheeks pale, his breath shallow, watching the outside world blur into chaos. His feet didn't reach the floor. He said nothing. The road said everything for him. Then came the curve, the one with no guardrail and too much rain. The truck slid. Tires lost grip. Lorraine screamed. The headlights spun across the cliffside trees like searchlights in panic. They hit a ridge of slick rock. The vehicle pitched sideways, skidded off the shoulder, and tumbled. Branches cracked, metal shrieked. The forest caught them with bone-breaking indifference. When it stopped, the silence came like a blanket dropped over everything. The front of the truck was wedged against a cedar trunk, its frame crumpled like paper. Steam rose from the shattered hood. Tom and Lorraine slumped forward in their seats, faces bloodied, unmoving. The windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks, shards pushed inward like glass teeth. Micah was still breathing. The seatbelt had snapped at the buckle, flinging him sideways between the front seats. His legs were tangled in the front armrest, one shoe missing, one arm pressed beneath his tiny chest. His body shook from shock and cold, but his eyes were open. He looked toward the broken glass of the passenger window. That's when the forest moved, not with noise. There was no sound, only the hush of falling rain and a deeper, older silence. Then something appeared through the shattered window. A hand. It didn't belong to any person. It was enormous, black with wet fur that hung in matted ropes, and it reached into the wreckage like it had done this before. It didn't fumble. It didn't tear. It pressed gently, palm first, behind Micah's neck, supporting his small head. Then another arm came through, bracing his back, cradling him like a broken bird. The boy's body rose, slow, careful, his arms dangling. The creature moved away into the dark. Later, when the rescue teams came, they found the truck. They found Tom and Lorraine, unconscious but breathing. But Micah was gone. No blood, no drag marks, just a pair of deep prints in the mud. Too wide, too long, no shoes. and beside them, small, child-sized footprints veering toward the trees. One of the paramedics stared too long and whispered something about the size. Sheriff Earl Tully told him to stop talking, but Evelyn Pike didn't stop looking. She stood at the edge of the scene, a flashlight in one hand and a jar of pickled peaches in the other. Her silver-gray braid clung to her soaked flannel collar. Her left cheek, burned and puckered from long ago, twitched slightly in the cold. She'd been on the volunteer search crew since '85 and always carried peaches when they went looking, an old habit from when they found hikers lost and scared, something sweet to welcome them back. She placed the jar at the trailhead without a word. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in what people don't say. The rain kept falling. Sheriff Tully turned to leave, radio crackling at his belt. "We'll regroup at dawn. Roads are closing. Too dangerous tonight." Evelyn didn't follow. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "If there's a chance he's alive, it's tonight or never." He stared at her. Her coat was already drenched. Her eyes weren't pleading. They never were. "Stay close to the trail," he muttered. "You see movement, you call." She didn't answer, just turned her light to the tree line and started walking. No one asked why she stayed. They didn't know she had seen the glass shards arranged in a strange way, spaced, almost like a pattern. They didn't know she'd followed the faint smell of cedar, not exhaust. They didn't see the other prints, the bigger ones, the ones that curved gently around the broken trunk and veered into the deeper dark. She did, and she remembered something from 20 years ago. Something they never let her say at the inquest, about how the fire in '72 wasn't the only thing that took her daughter. That there had been a figure in the smoke, towering, silent, watching the flames as if mourning. No one believed her. Maybe she had stopped believing herself. Until tonight. The forest was different past the first quarter mile. The rain seemed to mute, falling quieter the deeper she went. The trees leaned closer. The air got warmer, wetter, like breath on skin. She moved slowly, scanning the mossy ground. Her boots crushed pine needles and slick roots. Her flashlight beam caught something up ahead, tiny shoe prints in the mud, one socked, one bare, weaving like a trail left by a confused little soul. But beside them, always beside them, was something else. Something large, too heavy to leave just mud prints. It left indents, depth, weight. She stopped beside a wide cedar. The beam flicked across a patch of broken fern, then up to the trunk, then down again. Glass. A shard stuck upright in the moss. She crouched. Her knees cracked with age, but her fingers were steady. She picked it up. It didn't match the windshield. Too small. From the taillight, maybe, but placed, set gently in moss. She rose, turned her beam slowly left, and then the light caught a shimmer in the dark. 2 eyes. They didn't glow. They didn't flash red like in stories. They just absorbed the light. Big, black, motionless. Evelyn didn't breathe. The creature didn't blink. Then it did something strange. It lowered its head, slowly, deliberately, like a nod. Like a hello. She didn't run. The eyes faded back into shadow, swallowed by the forest. Only the rain remained. Far behind her, Sheriff Tully stood on the hood of his cruiser, radioing in weather reports. In town, people turned off porch lights and locked screen doors. No one knew a child had been taken, not stolen. No one knew there was a hand big enough to carry him and still touched nothing else. Evelyn knew. And she wasn't done searching. Not until she found the boy. Not until she knew if the creature that took him had teeth in its breath, or sorrow in its bones. Above the trees, thunder rolled again, a sound like warning, or maybe, just maybe, a mother's cry. The cave wasn't deep. Just a narrow pocket in the side of a moss-covered bluff, half hidden by fallen logs and the tangled bones of an old rock slide. But it was dry. Quiet. Still. The kind of stillness that felt older than the trees. Rain fell in sheets just beyond the entrance, breaking against the moss and ferns in a hush like whispers over velvet. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet stone, earth, and something else. Something faint, like smoke long faded, like fur warmed by breath. She placed him gently on a bed of moss and dry grass that had been layered with care. His small body folded awkwardly at first, knees curled, arms slack, but she adjusted him slowly, lifting one arm, tucking it under, laying the other across his chest. Her hands, massive and dark with soaked fur, moved with a precision that didn't belong to brute strength. She paused only once, crouching low, knees creaking as her weight shifted beside him. She leaned close, and then she breathed. Not a huff, not a snort, just a long, steady exhale through her wide nostrils, warm and low, like the sound of the wind blowing through a tunnel. Again and again. Her breath stayed slow, measured. The boy stirred, his lips parted. He blinked once, then twice, confusion flickering behind his lashes. But instead of crying, he turned toward the sound, like he knew it, like it meant something safe. He mirrored her. In his small chest, breath rose to match hers, deep, slow, almost reverent. Neither of them moved for a long time. A droplet slipped from the fur near her shoulder and landed on his cheek. He blinked again. Then, with tiny fingers still trembling, he reached up and touched her hand. Not out of fear, just contact. Skin met wet hair. He rubbed gently, wiping a patch of mud from the back of her wrist with the torn edge of his shirt. She didn't pull away. She didn't even look, just sighed and let her shoulders relax. The rain outside softened. Morning hadn't come, but the black of night began to dull around the edges. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a raven called once, sharp and brief. Then nothing. Miles downslope. Evelyn Pike was already awake. She'd never really slept. Her truck, parked near the downed tree line, was still ticking warm from the engine's heat. The coffee in her thermos had gone cold hours ago, but she didn't drink it for warmth. She drank it for steadiness. She'd followed the boy's footprints until the mud swallowed them. But the glass had told her more than the rain ever could. A shard of tail light wedged into the moss, not fallen but placed, like a marker, like a trail. She stood now, near the edge of a narrow gully where runoff streamed in lazy eddies down the slope. Her boots were soaked through. One hand rested against a cedar for balance, while the other held a flashlight low to the ground. It caught flecks of bark, muddy root clusters, old pine cones, but something else too. Thread, just a strand, blue, frayed, barely hanging to a branch at her knee. She reached out, pinched it carefully, held it to the light. Sweatshirt fleece, kid-sized. She looked uphill. Another flash in the beam. This time, not cloth, more glass. This one half buried under a leaf. It wasn't an accident. Someone, or something, was placing these pieces. Not in a straight line, but in a winding, deliberate path. Almost like. She squinted toward the ridge above. That's when she felt it. Not heard, not saw, felt. Like someone watching. Like a pause in the forest's breath. She held her own. For a moment, everything hung still. Then, in the periphery of her vision, just beyond the outer edge of her flashlight's reach, something moved. She turned the beam slowly. Eyes. Two of them. Not glowing, not shining. Just there. Huge, dark. Set deep in a face half shadowed by the forest itself. No sound, no motion. But the eyes didn't blink. They watched her, then lowered, slowly, softly. A nod. She didn't run, didn't move. She whispered almost to herself. You're showing me. The eyes vanished. She lowered the flashlight. At her feet, beside the branch, a small circle of flattened moss had been pressed under weight. One print, 4 toes, spread wide, larger than any bear she'd ever seen, larger than any human could make. Still fresh. Evelyn moved forward. Back in the cave, the boy stirred again. His breath still slow, still timed to the one beside him. The creature hadn't left. She sat now just beyond the opening, one shoulder against the rock, knees pulled high, arms crossed loosely in front of her chest. Not guarding, resting. Rainwater trickled from the fur along her spine, but she didn't shiver. She listened. The forest was noisy now. Not loud, but alive. Wind moved higher in the canopy. Frogs called from the marsh. Something distant and heavy. A branch falling, maybe. Maybe something else. Inside, the boy turned onto his side. His tiny fingers clutched a piece of moss. His lips moved once. No sound, just breath. She watched him. Then, almost too carefully to notice, she reached into the fold at her side and pulled something loose. A stone. Smooth. Oval. The kind you find only in riverbeds, worn for decades by current and time. She placed it beside him, barely brushing his hand, and left it there. Not a gift, a symbol. Outside, Evelyn crept carefully between slick stones, crouching low to avoid branches that slapped wet across her flannel. She could feel it now. Not just signs of passage, but intent. The trail was guiding her. Not in haste, not in fear, like she was being led. And then, just as the ridgeline broke and the slope fell away into a cradle of old growth, she saw it. A mouth of stone, carved not by tools but by water and time, half covered by bramble and moss. The opening gaped low, not tall enough for a man to walk upright, but something had been coming in and out of it for a long, long time. She crouched at the edge, breath held, and saw it. A small shoe, one blue and white Velcro strap, tucked neatly beside the entrance. She didn't call out, didn't move. Her eyes adjusted slowly. From the darkness within, two shapes took form. One curled on the moss, childlike, still. The other, unmoving at the mouth, part of the stone itself until it shifted slightly and revealed its shape. The head turned. Eyes met hers again. Not fear, not rage, just recognition. And something else, something close to memory. Evelyn lowered her flashlight. She did not speak. She simply reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the jar of peaches, still sealed, still cold, and placed it quietly at the threshold. Then turned and stepped back. No sudden moves, no threats. Just rain, just silence, just the hush of breath and the steady beat of something ancient moving through trees. Behind her, the stone mouth closed once more into shadow. And deep within, the slow, steady rhythm of shared breath continued. Like a lullaby forgotten by time. The boy sat near the entrance of the cave, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped around them. His breath still matched hers, slow and steady. But now there was a look in his eyes. Not fear, not anymore, but something else. Something curious, like he was beginning to see the pattern in things. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist that clung to the treetops, curling around trunks like smoke. The forest no longer moaned. It breathed. She was crouched beside the fireless bed of moss again, one massive arm resting on her knee. A patch of dried mud flaked from her hand. The boy glanced at it. He reached forward with careful fingers, brushed a streak off the back of her wrist. His touch lingered for just a moment. Then he looked down. Two of her fingers were shorter than the rest. Not by choice. The ends were gone. Clean, but not smooth. Blunt where they should have tapered. The fur didn't grow back there. Only skin, ridged and bare. Scar tissue old enough to have faded into the memory of pain, but not its shape. She didn't pull away when he touched it. She didn't look at him either. She just turned her hand over, palm up, and let it lie there, open. He sat quiet, tracing the edge of the calluses with the side of his thumb. Outside, Evelyn Pike leaned over a fallen cedar and squinted at a strange indentation in the moss. It wasn't a footprint, not exactly. It was more like a press, a shape left behind by weight, by presence. She'd followed them up the ridge, keeping low, moving quiet. The ground was drier now. That helped, but what she found just past the bend froze her in place, a handprint. Not the whole thing, just the edge. 4 fingers and the mark of a thumb spread wide like a starfish. But one of the fingers, maybe the index, maybe the ring, was shorter, blunt, missing its tip. She looked down at her own hand. The burn scars along her left palm caught the light of her flashlight. Skin like candle wax, melted and reformed. She flexed her fingers slowly. One knuckle cracked. The cold made it worse these days. She remembered the night it happened. 1972. A cabin fire out past Little Sheep Creek. Her daughter's room, already lost in the flames, and Evelyn, 29, charging in anyway. She didn't even feel the heat at first. She just felt the sound, the scream. Not her daughter's, her own. The door had collapsed. The beams were falling. She'd crawled out with her coat on fire. They pulled her off the grass, hands still smoldering. Her daughter never made it out. No one ever blamed her. But she blamed herself. Even now, when she closed her eyes, she could see the little girl's boots under the bed, could smell the pine walls burning, could hear that last noise. Not the fire. The silence that came after. She rubbed her palm along the moss beside the print. Something about that missing finger stuck with her. She kept moving. Back in the cave, the boy had started stacking things. Small things. Bits of bark, flat stones, clumps of dried moss. He laid them in a line across the cave floor, carefully, the way a child mimics order to make sense of chaos. She watched. Didn't stop him. He paused now and then to study her, as if checking for approval. But she gave none. Nor did she disapprove. She just sat, silent. He picked up a twig and used it to scrape a line in the dirt, curving the edge of his straight formation into a bend. Then another and another. It no longer looked like a line. It looked like a path. She reached out then, slow, deliberate, and rearranged the stones slightly, bumping one to the left, tilting another to curve just so. When she finished, he looked at it again. It was a spiral, a loop around the rock in the center. He looked up at her and smiled. She didn't smile back, but she blinked slowly. Outside the cave, a woodpecker knocked once, then twice. Near the base of the ridge, trouble was brewing. Roman Daly stood with his arms crossed beside the hood of his company truck, staring at a folded map of the Wallowa National Forest. His boots were caked in mud. His mood worse. "This route cuts straight across the northern boundary," he said, pointing to a red line. "We can widen it another 6 feet. Bring in the crawler before the freeze sets in. That ridge, too steep for runoff. Won't matter if it's near a ravine." Sheriff Earl Tully didn't look impressed. He glanced over the rim of his sunglasses. "You realize that ravine's about 100 yards from the crash site. It's federal land, not your call." "No, but it's my people's woods. And you've got one of those people missing. I'd think you'd want to clear a path." Earl didn't answer. Roman tapped the map again. "This area here, it's dead. Nothing lives up there but lichen and pine beetles. You keep talking about the boy. I keep offering to bring in machines that can cut us a way through faster." Earl folded the map. "You're not cutting a damn thing." Roman's jaw twitched, but he didn't push it. Not yet. Back inside the cave, the boy had started humming. No melody, just soft sound. A vibration. He rubbed the stone in the center of the spiral with one hand while the other stayed on the ground. She leaned her head down slightly, listening. Her breath joined his again, matched the tone. 2 lungs, 2 rhythms, same note. Then she moved. She stood up, slow, her head nearly brushing the ceiling. She turned toward the back of the cave. The boy followed her with his eyes but didn't rise. She stepped past him, into the narrow tunnel that led deeper in. He waited. Then, with bare feet padding over moss, he followed. They moved single file into the darker chamber. It wasn't much, just another hollow in the earth. But it held things. Bones, feathers. Stacked wood not for burning, but building. And in one corner, a pile of river stones. Not random. On the wall above the pile, a handprint. Brown with age, smeared but deliberate. 4 fingers, one missing 2 tips. She reached out and laid her hand against it, then stepped aside. Let him see. The boy walked forward slowly, fingers twitching at his sides. He didn't press his hand to the print. He just looked, and then sat. She sat beside him. Outside, Evelyn stood at the edge of a path that Roman Daly had marked months ago as a potential cut zone. She knew the company line. Clearing deadfall to reduce wildfire risk. What they really wanted was timber. Fast, cheap, unbothered. But she'd walked this stretch too many times not to notice the change. The path here wasn't dead. It had been used. Not by deer, not by elk. The moss had been disturbed. Twigs snapped clean. Not broken by hoof or paw, but lifted and moved. And something else. Along the western side of the slope, beside a rotting tree stump, lay a bundle of pine needles arranged in a neat little pile. Not blown, not dropped, placed, like bedding, like a marker. She knelt down, brushed the edge of her coat sleeve over the pile, found a small thread of blue again. Same fleece, same direction. She looked up. The trees swayed, but the air held something colder than wind. A decision. She turned back toward town, toward the sheriff's station, her jaw tight. She needed to tell Earl, and Nora, and maybe even the boy's parents. But deep down, she knew the truth already. If someone hunted that creature, the boy would never be safe. Not with them. Not with anyone. The cave stayed silent through the afternoon, and when night returned, it brought no storm, only stillness. Only breath. The wire had no business being there. Not in that part of the forest. Not stretched across a game trail barely wide enough for deer. It wasn't just fencing. It was meant to catch, to wound, to trap. Strung taut between 2 trees, rusted in places, braided with bits of orange flagging tape and twisted barbs meant to cut anything that dared push through. And she had pushed through. That much was clear. The brush around it was torn, moss smeared with streaks of dark hair and blood. The barbs were bent backward, as if something far too strong for its own good had ripped through without stopping. But she had stopped. Eventually. The sound wasn't loud, not like a scream. It was something deeper, a noise that didn't travel far but sank instead. A strangled breath drawn through grit teeth. A groan so low it seemed to come from the ground itself. Evelyn heard it before she saw anything. She froze mid-step, breath caught, boot half sunk in mud. The wind had shifted. The birds had gone silent. Only the far-off drip of melting snow punctuated the stillness. Then came the groan again. Long, drawn, pained. She moved slowly now. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from something worse. Recognition. She stepped around the cedar trunk, brush snapping under her coat, and saw her. The creature was on her knees, massive shoulders heaving, one arm braced against a boulder, the other limp at her side. Her fur, black and matted, was tangled with leaves and thorns. Blood welled from her hip, smeared thick across her flank and leg. The wire still clung to her like a snare, coiled and half torn. She was trying to stay upright, trying not to cry out, and failing. Evelyn didn't move at first. She just stood there, watching, her heart thudding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The air between them was thick with steam from the creature's breath, rising in slow clouds. Her body was trembling, not from cold, but from pain held too long. Her eyes lifted, not wide with panic, but low, heavy-lidded, like someone bracing for another blow. And then Evelyn moved. She didn't think. She didn't speak. She just dropped her pack and pulled the wire cutters from the side pocket. Her hands were already red from the cold, fingers stiff. She stepped forward. The creature didn't retreat. She didn't snarl. She didn't lift a hand. She just closed her eyes and let her chin drop to her chest. Evelyn knelt. The blood was sticky, warm. The scent of iron and pine sap filled her nose. She found the tension point of the wire near the thigh and traced it to the anchor. The barbs had gone deep. Her cutter blades slipped once. Evelyn hissed and dug again, snapping the first coil free. The wire recoiled with a metallic twang. The creature twitched, didn't cry out. Evelyn moved to the next strand, cut, then the last. The tension released with a sigh. The wire fell slack against the dirt. But her hands were bleeding now, tiny cuts lining the web between her thumb and forefinger. She didn't feel them. Only when she touched the creature's shoulder to brace her did she realize she was shaking. The creature opened her eyes again, and something changed. Her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, in gratitude. She didn't bow, didn't speak, but she breathed, deep, slow. A familiar rhythm. Evelyn mirrored it without realizing. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her coat, and stepped back. The creature turned slightly, tested her weight on one leg, winced. Then, without a sound, she took a step, and another. She disappeared between the trees. That night, the wind rose again. Back in town, the sheriff's office lit up with trucks and voices. The trailhead had been marked off by 2 squad cars, their headlights casting wide beams over the forest wall. Sheriff Earl Tully leaned against his hood, staring out into the dark with a look that hadn't changed in 40 years. Behind him, Evelyn approached with her coat still wet, blood dried in dark half-moons across her palms. Earl turned, eyebrows raised. "She's hurt," Evelyn said, voice flat. "You sure?" She didn't scream, not like anything else would. Earl didn't answer, just looked at her hands. Evelyn took a breath. It was the fencing. Roman's crew's been laying trap lines. That's not official protocol. Doesn't matter. They're doing it anyway. Earl straightened. His jaw clenched. And the boy. Evelyn nodded slowly. He's with her. You saw him? No, but I saw the way she looked at me after I cut the wire. Earl studied her face. Something there had shifted. Less anger, more resolve. Evelyn looked out toward the trees again. I think she's trying to return him. Trying. She left a sign. What kind of sign? Evelyn didn't answer right away. But back at the trailhead, half hidden beneath a flat rock near the old cedar, someone had placed a small, red knit cap. Mud-stained, flattened from wear. The kind of thing a child wears through winter. The name tag inside still read, Micah. Later that evening, the town meeting gathered in Joseph's rec hall. Tension was thick as smoke. Roman stood near the podium, arms folded, lips tight. He hadn't spoken yet. People were murmuring in pockets. Some were calling for search dogs, others for rifles. A few, mostly elders, said nothing. Sheriff Earl stepped forward, motioning for quiet. We've got 48 hours, he said. That's how long I'm putting a hold on any action. Roman scoffed. We lose 2 more days, that boy could be dead. Or we let something older than us try to finish what it started. Roman stepped forward, eyes sharp. That thing took a child, and brought his hat back. That's not proof. That's a taunt. No, Evelyn said from the back of the hall, stepping into the light. That's a sign of trust. Heads turned. She walked slow, holding up a small bundle of cloth, the red cap. People gasped. She left this. No blood, no tear, just a gift. Roman shook his head. You've all lost it. No, Evelyn said, voice rising slightly. You're the one who's afraid of something you can't trap. The room quieted, and then, from the far end of the hallway, small footsteps echoed. Micah stood in the doorway, alive, breathing, covered in pine needles. Everyone froze. He didn't speak, didn't cry. He stepped forward slowly, looked out over the room, and placed both hands flat on his chest. Then, slowly, deliberately, he breathed out. Low, deep, like a wind moving through stone. No one spoke. The boy breathed again. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't human. It wasn't threatening. It was familiar. A borrowed breath from the trees. Then he lifted his hands, mimicking the rhythm again, and the room followed. One breath, then silence. The meeting ended without a vote. That night, Sheriff Earl stood on the steps of the rec hall, watching the fog creep back in from the lake. Evelyn stood beside him. "Do you think she's still out there?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "She never left." He didn't reply, but in his chest, he carried a breath he hadn't taken in years. The kind you hold when something sacred moves past you and you're too afraid to speak. In the dark, far from town, a shadow leaned into the wind, and the forest listened. Under the humming lights of the Joseph Community Hall, folding chairs creaked and boots scraped on old hardwood. People had started showing up before dawn, wrapped in canvas coats and wet denim, tracking slush through the double doors. By noon, the place was full. Locals from the valley and ranchers from higher up in the hills. A few logging men, a pair of volunteer firefighters, mothers with babies asleep on their chests. Nobody smiled, not even the children, not after the radio said what it said. The meeting wasn't official, not exactly, but everyone knew why they were there. Something had crossed a line. The boy was safe, miraculously, but what brought him back still walked the forest. That fact alone was gasoline. Some folks were ready to burn it all down just to feel like they were in control again. Evelyn Pike sat in the second row from the back, her flannel still damp from the fog, her fingers laced tight around a worn thermos. Sheriff Earl stood near the front with his hands on his belt, his hat tucked under his arm. Roman Daly leaned against the wall beside the map of the Wallowa timber boundaries, chewing the inside of his cheek, waiting to speak. But it was Dr. Nora Whitfield who stood first. She adjusted her glasses and stepped into the open, chin high, voice calm. "We're not just talking about a creature," she said. "We're talking about a presence that predates any of us, something that chose not to harm the child, something that, by all accounts, cared for him." Roman snorted. "You want to put that thing in a zoo?" "No," she said sharply. "I want to leave it alone." Murmurs rose. Someone near the back scoffed. Another muttered something about hippie nonsense. Roman straightened and pushed off the wall. "With respect, Doc, that thing ain't a folk tale anymore. It's not a blurry photo. It's real, which means it's dangerous. We got men in our crew too scared to fell near the North Ridge. One slipped trying to get a picture. If that thing turns..." "Turns what?" Evelyn said, rising from her seat. "Turns on who?" The room shifted. Earl stepped forward, palms out. "Let's keep it civil." But Evelyn was already walking down the aisle, slow and even. She held up her hand, and in it was something small. A patch. Red knit. Faded. "I stitched this," she said. 30 years ago, for my daughter's winter cap. Same pattern I used to mend Micah's. I recognize the yarn. It came from a store that closed in '89. She set the patch on the table beside the sheriff and looked up at the crowd. That creature didn't just bring him back. She fixed the hat. The room fell into a hush so sharp you could hear the pop of the old furnace kicking in. "And what does that prove?" Roman barked. "That it's got a motherly instinct? So do grizzlies. Doesn't mean I'd let one baby sit." "No," Evelyn said. "But it means we're not dealing with an animal." Nora stepped beside her. "We have a chance to do something rare here. To protect something older than law, older than property lines." Roman's voice cut back in, sharp. "And what happens when it doesn't play nice next time?" Earl cleared his throat. But before he could speak, the door creaked. Every head turned. Micah stood in the entryway, small and silent, his coat too big, his eyes too still. He didn't say a word. He just looked around the room, his lips pressed together, his chest rising and falling slow. Then he stepped forward. The room parted for him. He walked straight to the front, barefoot, his small toes red from cold. His fingers clutched the edge of his shirt, and he stood there between Evelyn and Nora like he knew exactly where he was supposed to be. He looked up at Sheriff Earl. Then he closed his eyes and breathed. Not fast, not panicked. One long, deep exhale, drawn from the belly. Then another. The room was silent. He opened his eyes, raised his hands to his chest, and did it again. A low breath pulled slowly inward, then let go with calm. A sound that didn't belong to him. It belonged to something bigger. Something that had slept beside him in the cold. That had taught him rhythm, not speech. A language of safety made from silence and air. People watched, confused. And then something in the room shifted. Evelyn felt it in her ribs first, the way people do when they realize they've been breathing wrong for a long time. She mimicked the boy's pace. So did Nora. And then, like water finding a groove in dry land, others followed. A room of 23 souls, all breathing together. No one talked. No one dared. Micah stepped forward one last time, reached into his coat, and pulled out a single item. It was a stone. Small, round, smooth, like it had been held a long while in someone's palm. He placed it gently on the floor at Roman Daly's feet, then walked back toward the door. Sheriff Earle's voice came after him. "I'm issuing a stay on all hunt orders, 72 hours. No traps, no patrols, no noise." Someone in the back mumbled. Someone else cursed under breath. But no one moved. Roman stared at the stone at his boot. Didn't pick it up. Didn't kick it either. Outside, the sky was darkening. Clouds rolled low over the valley floor. Sheriff Earle stood alone for a long time after the room cleared, his hand resting on the map. Nora helped Evelyn gather folding chairs. Micah sat on the front steps, staring into the trees. Inside, someone had left the stone where it sat. Unclaimed, not forgotten. Later that night, the sheriff drove up the ridge alone. No radio. No lights. He parked near the trailhead and walked the rest by foot. The trees swayed slow in the breeze. No birds. No frogs. Just that hush again. He stopped at the cedar, kneeled, ran his hand along the soil until he found it. Not a footprint, but a groove, deep and still fresh. He placed his hand beside it, felt something in his chest he couldn't name. Then behind him, a sound. Not close, not loud, just a long, slow breath. He turned. Nothing there. Just trees. Just fog. Just the memory of something watching, waiting. He didn't raise his gun. He didn't speak. He just nodded and walked back toward his truck. But in his pocket, he kept a stone. One he hadn't told anyone about. One he found tucked into his driver's side mirror before sunrise. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew enough not to throw it away. By morning, the boy would be gone again, but not lost, not taken, just returned for now. And in the woods, a breath would echo his own, long, steady, waiting. Spring came late that year. The mountains held onto their ice like they were afraid to let go, and when they finally did, it wasn't gentle. The creeks swelled fast. Snowmelt surged down from higher ridges, carrying broken branches, loosened rocks, and the restless weight of months locked in silence. In town, the river pushed high against its banks, chewing at roots and flooding the edge of the old baseball field. Dogs barked more. Children stayed inside. Something in the wind felt unfinished. The kind of unfinished that made mothers wake in the middle of the night for no reason at all. That morning, Evelyn woke before her coffee percolated. Her boots were already by the door, and her coat still carried the scent of wood smoke from last night. She didn't plan to go out again. Not until the meeting about the quiet zone. Not until Earle made it official. But something tugged. By the time the sun rose behind the pine ridge, she was halfway up the trail, and Micah was already gone. They found the back door ajar. Just a few inches, but enough. His boots were still by the mat. His jacket missing. A folded note on the windowsill. No words. Just a curved line drawn in crayon, looping around a small flat stone. Below it, carefully placed, a row of pine needles. Arranged, not scattered. Lorraine collapsed against the kitchen table. Tom stared at the door like it had swallowed him whole. Earle stood on the porch, jaw tight, eyes scanning the yard for any sign of a trail. But there wasn't one. No footprints in the soft mud. No drag marks. Just the breeze and the slow drip of snowmelt from the gutters. Evelyn arrived 5 minutes later. She didn't ask. She just nodded, then turned toward the trees. Further up the ridge, the air was colder. The wind whistled low and steady, dragging wet leaves along the edges of the old deer trail. The moss was thick and spongy, but in one spot it was flattened. Not just once. Repeated. A child's weight. Bare feet. Then came the pine needles, arranged again. A line. then a curl, then a break, where the shape changed course. Evelyn crouched and touched them gently. Not wind, not random. A message, if you knew how to read it. She stood, started walking faster. The forest deepened. Somewhere far off, a raven called, and the sound of boots broke the stillness behind her. Roman Daly's men, 5 of them, dressed in blaze orange and carrying rifles slung loose across their backs. One had a machete strapped to his thigh. Another checked the scope on his hunting rifle as he walked. Their faces were stiff, focused. Roman wasn't with them, but Evelyn knew whose orders they followed. They didn't speak to her, didn't need to. She kept going, didn't slow, but her hands began to shake. Micah was moving fast. He followed a line only he could see, dipping through brush and stepping over roots like the forest was showing him where not to fall. His hair was wet, his cheeks red. His breath came in slow pulls, just like he'd been taught. The way she had shown him, the way she breathed when the wind got sharp and the nights felt too long. He remembered everything. The cave, the moss, her hand beside his, the sound of her chest when she rested close. And when the trail forked, when the earth split into ice on one side and rising sun on the other, he followed the cold. She would be there. He could feel it. The water roared louder now. The creek had burst over its banks. It flooded the lower flats, turning stumps into islands and trails into rivers. Micah stood at the edge of it, his feet half sunk in the soft earth. Across the water, the line of trees broke open. He saw the bend in the ridge. The same bend she always stopped at before sundown, where she turned back, where she waited. He stepped forward, but the current was too fast. He stopped, scanned the bank, found a fallen log bridging the water a few feet downstream. He climbed it, balanced with arms out, and crossed. At the other side, he dropped to his knees and pressed his palms to the ground, felt the cool of the moss, the wet of the bark, the rhythm. She was near. He stood and ran. Behind him, Roman's men had split into 2 groups. 3 followed the upper ridge trail. 2 cut toward the river. The snow was melting faster now, turning patches of ground into slick ice. One man cursed as he slid down a muddy embankment. Another raised his rifle and scanned the tree line. Then they heard it. Not a growl, not a scream, just that sound again. Breath, low, measured, carried on the wind like something ancient trying to stay calm. They froze. Micah ran toward the sound, and she stepped from the trees, massive, broad-shouldered, wet from the rain and streaked with pine needles. Her fur clung to her ribs. One side of her hip still bore the scar from the wire trap, but her eyes were wide, her mouth still, her hands low at her sides. Micah stopped in front of her. She lowered to one knee, opened her arms, and pulled him in. The sound she made wasn't joy. It was relief. Behind them, the men saw movement. One raised his rifle, didn't fire, just aimed. Evelyn came up behind him, grabbed the barrel, and shoved it down hard. "You'll kill him too." The man's mouth opened, closed. He didn't fire, but one of the others slipped. The ground cracked. The bank gave way. A man fell sideways into the rushing creek, hitting the ice with a sound like splintered glass. His scream echoed sharp and wild. She turned, saw him. Micah pulled back from her chest. She moved. In 3 strides, she reached the edge, crouched low, and reached into the freezing water. The man flailed. The current dragged him sideways, his arms slapping at the surface, boots kicking but finding no grip. Then her hand closed around his wrist. He stared up at her, eyes wide with terror. She didn't let go. Her feet dug into the mud, her shoulders bunched tight, and with one powerful pull, she lifted him halfway from the water. He gasped, coughing. Mud soaked his collar. His rifle floated away behind him. He hung in her grip like a child, and she set him down, gently on the bank. Micah watched. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart hammering. One of the men dropped to his knees. No one spoke. Not for a long time. The man she saved looked up at her, then at the others, said nothing, but didn't reach for his weapon. She looked at Micah one last time, then backed into the trees, vanished. like a shadow at dusk, and the forest closed behind her. Micah turned to Evelyn. She knelt and opened her arms. He ran to her, buried his face in her coat. She didn't cry, but she breathed, one long, low exhale, matched by the wind. And somewhere beyond the ridge, breath answered back, even, steady, ancient. Still listening, the wind carried smoke long before the town saw flame. It rolled through the valley in thin ribbons, sharp and acrid, the kind that caught behind the teeth and made the dogs whine before anyone even checked the sky. By midday, the air turned a strange color, something between copper and bruise. Evelyn stepped onto her porch and tasted it before she smelled it. Her hand went instinctively to the pocket where she kept the stone. They said it was lightning, a dry strike out past Chief Joseph Ridge, sparked on sun-bleached timber and caught in the wrong kind of wind. It traveled low first, licking through underbrush like it was testing something. Then it found the old felled trees from last year's cuts. Roman's crew had left them to rot near the north boundary, stacked like cordwood, waiting for a season that never came. The fire didn't wait. It jumped fast, moved like it knew where to go. By the time the trucks were loaded, it was already chewing at the edge of the switchback trail near Crater Hollow. That meant less than 3 hours before it crossed into the high forest. And if it reached the limestone drop, nothing would stop it. Not there. At the station, Sheriff Earl slammed his fist down on the map. Nora was already dialing the fire marshal. Roman stood with his mouth shut for once, arms crossed too tightly to look natural. Evelyn didn't say a word. She just stared at the red X someone had marked 2 months ago, an old hand-drawn symbol for the cave's mouth, passed around in whispers but never officially logged. She knew what stood near that ridge, what would never outrun a crown fire, what had never known man's destruction at this scale. Micah tugged at her coat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. They loaded 2 trucks. Evelyn drove the lead. Behind her, Nora mapped escape routes with shaking fingers. Her other hand clutched around a scarf soaked in eucalyptus oil to fight the sting of smoke. Earl rode shotgun, his old hunting boots tapping a slow rhythm against the floorboard, as if he was counting down something. The dirt road curved like a spine through the dry hills. Dust rose and vanished behind them. Up ahead, the sky pulsed orange behind a ridge that used to mean shelter. Birds flew crooked through the smoke. The fire had started to crown, tall enough now that trees ignited mid-air, needles crackling in bursts before the branches even blackened. Evelyn didn't look at the horizon. She looked at the watch on her wrist. Her late husband's. It still worked. Still counted time in small, steady ticks. He used to say fire doesn't chase people, it chases mistakes. They reached the junction near the old quarry by late afternoon. The heat there was alive. Not just temperature, but presence. The way it pressed into the chest. The way it made breath short and hearts feel too large. Roman's second truck stopped behind them. The crew in back unloaded a crate of shovels and canvas bags, the kind used for last-ditch trench lines. But the ground here was too rocky for a break, and the wind wasn't on their side. The plan, if it could be called that, was to cut south through the mine trail, bypass the ravine, and get ahead of the fire line. They'd meet it near the secondary ridge, just beyond what the locals called Devil's Elbow. If they could create a fire break there, if they could burn just enough, they might redirect it. It was desperate, but it was all they had. They hiked in fast. Smoke thickened. Light turned strange, sepia at first, then rust, then the dead gray of memory. Micah walked between Evelyn and Nora, holding their hands, though he looked far calmer than either of them. Once, he stopped and placed his hand against a tree, just flat against the bark, listening, then kept going. The air burned their throats by the time they reached the ridge. Ash floated sideways like feathers, and then the mountain opened. Evelyn froze mid-step. Down in the narrow cut of the gulch, framed by jagged rock and shaded beneath a soot-streaked ledge, stood not one, but 3. Not just her, a younger one, smaller, leaner, the shape of a juvenile, fur darker and shorter, eyes wide with alertness, and another, taller than both, male, massive. His chest rose slow. His arms hung heavy at his sides. He stood between the cave and the fire line, not blinking. They weren't hiding. They were waiting. Evelyn stepped forward. Micah didn't hesitate. He broke from her side and walked straight down the slope, the path he'd once taken in silence, now filled with ash and drifting cinders. The young one moved first, crouching low and reaching toward him. They met in the middle. No words, just breath, a soundless reunion. Behind them, the sky roared. The fire was close now, only a ridge away. Flames leapt like dancers across the tops of spruce, cracking trunks in half with a sound like gunfire. Evelyn looked at Earl. He nodded once. She turned to Nora. "The cabin. You sure?" "It's the only clearing wide enough. We burn it right. It'll eat the fuel before the fire gets here." They moved fast. The cabin was hers. Old, weather-worn. Still standing because it had meaning, not because it was useful. Built by her husband in 1974, with timber hauled from the creek by mule. Its walls held wedding photos and the smell of split pine. But now it had to go. They pulled kerosene from the truck, soaked the base. Nora stacked brush near the walls. Evelyn lit the first match, watched it catch, watched her life go up with it. The fire climbed fast, devouring the roof before the walls buckled. It spread out in waves, heat blooming outward like a second sun. The air shimmered. The forest paused. And then, like a great throat swallowing back flame, the fire turned. It bent around the cabin's edge, split just enough, slowed just long enough. The creatures stood on the far slope, watching. The male stepped forward, picked up a stone the size of a grapefruit, and set it gently beside a root, then turned away. The young one followed. The mother paused last. She stepped down the ridge toward Evelyn, close enough to see the white thread still tangled in her fur, close enough to smell the sweat and smoke on Evelyn's coat. She reached out one hand, not fast, not fearful, and placed something in Evelyn's palm, a stone, worn smooth. No carvings, no marks, just weight, memory, and warmth. Evelyn didn't speak, didn't cry. She just nodded, and the creature nodded back, then slipped into the dark behind the smoke. By morning the ridge was black, but the gulch still stood. So did the cave, and the boy walked the trail again, this time with others at his side, breathing, quiet, unbroken, and watched from above by eyes that understood what it meant to be spared. Not saved, but spared. A year passes differently when the forest is watching. Time doesn't move in hours or minutes anymore. It drifts, slow as fog rising from the ground in spring, measured by the bloom of ferns and the way the creek shifts its song after a hard rain. By the time the leaves turned again, by the time the frost crept back into the soil and the mornings cracked like thin ice under boot soles, Joseph had changed. Not loud, not sudden. Just enough. Enough to feel like breath held a little longer, like voices softened near the trees, like something unspoken had taken root between people who used to pass one another without nodding. The sign went up in early September. Sheriff Earl helped set the post, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hammer in hand, while Nora stood a few feet back marking the corners with orange twine. The wood was rough, nothing polished, nothing too official. Just a simple cedar plank nailed across two uprights, carved by hand and darkened with linseed oil. The words weren't big. They didn't need to be. Quiet zone. Foot traffic only. No border, no fence, no cameras. Just space. Agreed upon, respected, not enforced by law, but by something deeper, like reverence or memory. The townspeople voted on it 3 months after the fire. Not everyone agreed. Roman left the meeting before it ended, muttering about liability and timber profits and how sentiment didn't keep lights on. But he didn't fight it. Not anymore. Maybe something in him had shifted too, standing on that ridge, watching a creature haul one of his own men from the icy flood with hands that didn't kill, only held. Now Roman walks different, quieter. carries wood to the trailhead some weekends, helps split it, builds benches without asking who requested them, just works, leaves before anyone thanks him. His name isn't on the plaque, but his hands are. Micah turned 6 in June. He doesn't talk much, not the way other kids do, but he's not silent either. He listens better than most adults, eyes like weathered glass catching every flicker, every pause. On Thursdays, he leads the little ones from town along the quiet trail. They walk single file. No one runs, no one shouts. The parents wait near the chapel fence, thermoses in hand, watching like they used to watch school buses. The children disappear into the tree line for an hour. They always return. Evelyn goes too. Not every time. Just often enough to walk behind them, boots steady on the earth, eyes half lowered, counting small heads and small shadows. She carries nothing but a folded cloth in her coat and a smooth stone that never leaves her pocket. Her hair is whiter now, pulled back in the same loose braid. The scar on her cheek has softened at the edges. Some days, she presses her hand to the bark of the cedar by the trailhead and breathes in deep before moving forward. Micah stops sometimes mid-trail. Not from tiredness. He listens, not with his ears, with something else. Then he shows the other kids how to breathe. He lifts his shoulders slow, fills his chest, and lets it go. Not loud, not sharp, just steady. He doesn't explain. He doesn't perform. He teaches by doing. They copy him. The woods hold still when they do, and the sound of their breath blends with the wind through the high branches like a song no one wrote down. Further back, Sheriff Earl walks with his hands behind his back. He doesn't wear a sidearm in the zone. Never did. Even after the vote passed. He says it doesn't belong there, that it never did. Sometimes people ask if he's afraid. He smiles without showing teeth and says, "Not of what's out there." Then he walks on. Nora's field station sits just outside the buffer line. Solar panels now, though they weren't cheap. Her grant went through in spring. She doesn't call the area a sanctuary. Says that's not hers to name, but her notebooks are full. Her voice recorder is quiet most days, but every once in a while she catches something in the distance. Too slow to be wind, too deep to be elk. She logs it, but she never plays it back in public. Late in October, the light changes again. The valley glows gold, then rust, then pale. The first frost lines the tips of the meadow grasses. Micah walks the trail alone that afternoon. Not far, just to the bend where the ridge dips and the sun slants through in long bars, catching the mist rising off the fern beds. He stops near the cedar stump where Evelyn once left her peaches. He crouches, opens his palm, places a tiny sprig of sage he picked from beside the cabin ruins. Not wrapped, not marked, just placed. He doesn't wait. He turns to go, but he hears it, the hush of weight moving across leaves. He doesn't run. He doesn't smile. He stops, lets his breath slow. Then he feels it. Not a hand, not a touch, just the air moving behind him, warm and even. A breath. He nods, keeps walking. Back on the porch, Evelyn sits with a wool blanket across her knees. She watches the tree line, sees him step out. Alone, but not. He walks up to her, reaches into his coat pocket, pulls out something she hasn't seen in months. A stone. Not hers, not his. New. Still warm. He places it in her hand. She doesn't speak. She closes her fingers around it, looks toward the horizon, and somewhere deep in the trees, where fire never touched, where old roots sleep beneath layers of moss, something exhales again. Low, rhythmic, recognized, not claimed, just remembered. The sun dips behind the mountain, the wind stills, and the forest listens. Sometimes what we fear in the shadows is simply something waiting to be understood. And sometimes what disappears into the woods is not lost. It's becoming something else, something sacred in its silence. This story was never really about monsters or myths. It was about what happens when we choose to listen instead of hunt, when we learn to breathe alongside what we don't yet understand. and when we let go of the need to name everything that doesn't look like us. There are places in this world where the old still breathes, where the trees remember, and where the ground hums with truths too deep for words. Not everything needs to be seen to be known. Not everything needs to be proven to be real. Some things, some connections, are felt in the stillness between footsteps, in the hush before dawn, in the long quiet of a shared breath. And when we make space for those moments, when we choose reverence over fear, something in us shifts. We start to heal. We start to belong, not just to each other, but to the earth again. This wasn't just a tale about survival or belief. It was a story about trust, about what happens when two worlds meet in the broken places, not to conquer, but to coexist, and how even the deepest wounds, grief, guilt, distance, can be stitched together through small, quiet acts of care. Because in the end, we are not so different. We all carry stories in our bones. We all long to be seen without being hunted, to be remembered without being caged. And maybe the truest kind of peace isn't in taming what's wild, but in honoring its right to remain so. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a memory, a silence, a breath you once shared with something unspoken, I invite you to leave a comment below. Tell us what part stayed with you. Share your thoughts. And if you'd like to walk with us again through stories that ask deeper questions, stories that listen, not just speak, please subscribe, follow, and stay close. Thank you for being here. The forest always remembers who walked gently.